The fjord was quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Dawn had only just begun to brush the sky with pale streaks of grey and silver, and the waters of the inlet lay still, reflecting the faintest shimmer of early light. Mist drifted low over the surface, curling and folding like spirits moving silently across the waves. The air smelled of pine, damp earth and salt, a mingling of scents that spoke of the land and the sea together, two forces intertwined in the life of those who lived here. This was the Viking world, both unforgiving and breathtaking, a place where survival was not given but earned with every season. High cliffs rose on either side of the water, their jagged edges softened by the morning fog. Dark evergreens clung stubbornly to the rock, their roots twisted deep into cracks where soil had gathered over countless years. Seabirds circled slowly above, their wings barely moving, carried effortlessly by the wind. The faint cries of gulls echoed across the still expanse, breaking the silence in small sharp fragments before fading into the vastness again. It was a world where nature spoke in whispers and long pauses, a world that reminded anyone who stood there just how small human life was compared to the endless wilderness around them. Along the shoreline, the village slept. Wooden houses with turf roofs blended into the slope of the land, as though they had grown directly from the earth. Smoke no longer rose from the chimneys. The fires had burned down low during the night, leaving only faint embers glowing beneath layers of ash. The night's chill lingered, sharp against the skin, making breath appear in white clouds with every exhale. Inside the homes, families rested close together, wrapped in furs and wool, their bodies conserving warmth for the day ahead. Sleep was precious, for the work of survival would begin again soon, demanding strength and endurance from every member of the community. Yet even in this silence, there was tension, an invisible thread stretched across the village. For though the fjord seemed serene, every person here knew that life was never far from hardship. Food did not simply wait on the table, it had to be sought, captured and carried back through effort, courage, and sometimes blood. The coming hunt was already in everyone's thoughts, even in dreams. It lingered like a shadow, a reminder that what happened out there, in the forest, on the sea against the strength of beasts, would determine whether this community saw comfort or hunger in the weeks to come. The world here did not forgive weakness. Winters were long, and when snow swallowed the land, hunting grew harder with every passing day. A single kill could make the difference between endurance and starvation, between joy and sorrow. That is why, as the sky slowly lightened, the air seemed charged, as though the gods themselves were watching, waiting to see what the day would bring. A soft breeze stirred the surface of the fjord, rippling the reflection of the cliffs and the pale sky. Somewhere far in the distance, the deep crash of a wave against rock echoed faintly, carried inward like a reminder of the endless sea beyond. This place was not merely a backdrop for human life. It was a force, vast and eternal, shaping the destiny of everyone who dared to live along its shores. The Vikings knew this. They did not think of themselves as masters of the land and sea, but as participants in its rhythms, challengers in its trials. The fjord, the forest, the mountains, these were not passive landscapes, but living presences, powerful and watchful. As the mist began to thin, the first colors of dawn revealed themselves in soft hues. Pale gold streaked the edges of the clouds, and the water turned from gray to silver, then to the faintest suggestion of blue. Shadows retreated slowly, uncovering the rocky beach where boats were pulled ashore. These vessels, long and narrow, rested silently like sleeping serpents. Their carved prows rose toward the sky, shaped into the heads of beasts that seemed almost alive in the half-light. They were more than boats, they were lifelines, carrying men out into the unknown, into danger and possibility alike. A lone figure stirred near the water's edge. Wrapped in a heavy cloak, one of the villagers stepped out early, drawn by habit or by restlessness. His boots pressed softly into the damp sand, leaving faint impressions that the tide would soon erase. He paused, gazing across the fjord, and inhaled deeply the cold, sharp air. Perhaps he thought of the hunt that awaited. Perhaps he prayed silently to Odin or Frey for strength and fortune. Or perhaps he simply admired the beauty of the morning, knowing that such quiet moments were rare and fleeting. For soon the silence would end. Soon voices would rise in the village, as fires were rekindled, as tools were gathered, as the hunters prepared to leave. Children would peek through doorways, watching fathers and brothers ready themselves with spear and bow. Women would whisper prayers as they packed provisions, eyes heavy with worry and hope. The fjord that now seemed timeless and still would become alive with sound and motion. Yet in this suspended moment, just before the day began, it was as if the whole world balanced delicately on the edge of possibility. This was the stage upon which life unfolded for the Vikings, not a land of ease, but a land of majesty and demand. The fjords held beauty that could still the heart, but beneath that beauty lay hunger, cold and risk. The people who called this place home had learned to read the signs of the sky, the moods of the sea, the habits of the animals. Every success was hard won, every failure carried consequences that could not be ignored. And so, as the listener drifts deeper into the story, imagine yourself standing there, on that shore, in the chill of the dawn, with the quiet mist curling around your feet. Feel the weight of silence, the weight of expectation. Ahead lies a story not only of a hunt, but of survival, of tradition, and of the strength of a people who found a way to feed entire villages with the courage of a few. The fjords, timeless and eternal, bear witness, and now so do you. Life in the Viking world was never simple, never predictable, and never secure. Every season carried its own challenges, and every challenge held the potential to tip the fragile balance between life and death. To live in Scandinavia during these centuries was to know hardship, not as an occasional visitor, but as a constant companion. The beauty of the land, the soaring mountains, the endless forests, the cold, glittering seas, was matched equally by its mercilessness. It was a world that demanded strength, unity and resilience from its people. Without these, no family, no village, and no community could endure. The winters were long, stretching like an eternity across the land. Snow fell heavy and deep, burying fields, covering paths and sealing the earth in silence. Days shortened until the sun barely skimmed the horizon, casting only a pale, weak light before vanishing again into darkness. For weeks at a time, the night seemed endless, broken only by the shimmer of the northern lights, painting the sky in ghostly green and silver. The cold was a living force, piercing, unrelenting, seeping into bones no matter how many furs one wore. It filled lungs with sharp air and stiffened fingers, until even the smallest tasks became an effort of will. During these months, survival depended on what had been gathered and stored. Food laid aside in summer and autumn determined whether a family sat with full bowls by the fire or stared into empty pots. Grain, dried fish, salted meat, smoked cuts and stored roots, each was precious, measured carefully, and rationed to last as long as possible. When supplies ran low, desperation followed swiftly. Hunger was not a distant fear, but a reality that pressed closer with every passing day of scarcity. But even in summer, life offered no ease. The growing season was short. Farmers worked long hours in the fields, plowing, planting and harvesting with urgency, aware that every missed opportunity could cost them dearly in the winter ahead. Weather could turn without warning, storms flattening crops, rains flooding the soil, or sudden cold snaps killing what had only just begun to sprout. To farm in the Viking lands was to gamble against nature, hoping that the gods or fortune would grant enough to carry through the next year. And so the people turned, often to the hunt and the sea. Both provided what the land sometimes withheld. The forests teemed with animals, but not in endless numbers. Deer, elk, boar and smaller creatures like hares and foxes. Each was vital, and each required skill and patience to capture. The sea was a giver and taker alike, offering fish in abundance one day, and fierce storms the next. Nets and lines brought in cod, herring and salmon, yet the ocean's moods could snatch away boats and men with merciless suddenness. It was in this environment that the great hunts took on their enormous importance. A single whale stranded on a beach, a massive elk brought down in the forest, or a wild boar speared after a dangerous chase. These moments were not merely victories, but blessings of survival. One successful hunt could feed an entire village for weeks, sometimes months. It was abundance arriving all at once, a treasure of meat and fat, of hides and bone, of marrow and sinew. In times of scarcity, it was the difference between despair and celebration. The Vikings understood this balance deeply. They lived with the knowledge that life was always close to the edge. They could not afford waste, nor could they afford complacency. Every hunt was undertaken with reverence, because it was never only about meat, it was about life itself. When hunters went into the forest or onto the sea, they carried the weight of every hungry child, every weary elder, every anxious mother who stayed behind, waiting for their return. Within the village, this understanding created a bond of shared fate. Survival was not individual, but collective. If one family struggled, the others felt it. If one hunter succeeded, the entire community rejoiced. No one could afford to stand apart, for the elements were too harsh, the risks too great. Together they worked, shared and endured. The hunt symbolized this unity, the strength of a few sustaining the lives of many. Yet this unity was constantly tested. Famine was not an abstract threat. It had names, faces and memories. There were years when crops failed, when animals were scarce, when storms destroyed stored food. In those years, hunger hollowed cheeks and stole the energy from bodies. Children cried at night from emptiness. Elders grew frail and silent, and the very fabric of the community strained under the weight of desperation. People remembered these times, passing down the stories as warnings. The memory of hunger lingered like a scar, reminding each generation of the necessity of the hunt. Even so, life was not without its moments of hope and joy. When a hunt succeeded, when the storerooms were filled, when fires blazed bright against the winter's darkness, these moments carried a weight of celebration far greater than simple feasting. They were triumphs against a world that often seemed determined to press humanity down. They were proof that courage, skill and endurance could carve survival from a harsh land. And for the Vikings, these victories became more than survival. They became stories, legends, part of the identity of a people who refused to be defeated by their world. As we imagine the village in these times, we can see the contrast clearly. One day, pots sit nearly empty, bellies ache, and fear hangs heavy in the air. Another day, after a successful hunt, smoke rises from every chimney, laughter echoes across the houses, and the rich scent of roasting meat fills the cold wind. The same place, the same people, yet transformed utterly by the presence or absence of food. This was the fragile balance that defined their lives. The land of the Vikings was one of beauty, yes, but beauty edged with danger, beauty that demanded reverence. The fjords, the forests, the seas they gave, and they took. They tested every person who lived among them, shaping them into a people who knew endurance, who valued strength, who honored the gods and the earth for every gift of survival. The world of harsh survival was not a backdrop to their story. It was the heart of it, the foundation upon which every hunt, every feast, and every legend was built. And as the story unfolds, we remember this truth: behind every great Viking hunt lay the shadow of hunger. Behind every feast lay the memory of famine. Behind every moment of triumph lay the fear of failure. This contrast was what gave their lives intensity, meaning and urgency. It was the same contrast that made the success of one single hunt capable of sustaining not only stomachs, but spirits, for an entire season. As the faint light of morning grew stronger, the village slowly began to stir. Smoke once more rose from chimneys, thin grey ribbons curling upward into the cool air, a sure sign that fires had been rekindled inside. The crackle of wood and the smell of burning pine spread through the narrow lanes, bringing warmth to the waking world. Wooden doors creaked open, and figures wrapped in wool and fur stepped outside, blinking against the pale glow of dawn. The day had begun, but it was not like any other day. Today was a day of waiting. Children were the first to show their excitement. Their small feet pattered quickly across the dirt paths between houses, leaving fresh tracks in the damp earth. Their voices carried bright notes into the morning stillness as they chased each other along the shore. Some pointed toward the longboats resting on the beach, imagining themselves as hunters, warriors or sailors. With sticks in hand they pretended to throw spears, their laughter mingling with the cries of seabirds overhead. Though they did not fully understand the stakes, they could sense the importance of the day through the hushed conversations of their parents, through the solemn faces of the men sharpening weapons, through the way the entire village seemed to hold its breath. The women worked steadily, their movements practiced and efficient. Some carried baskets of dried fish or bread, to be packed for the hunter's journey. Others repaired nets, stitched clothing, or checked the condition of leather waterskins. Each task was small on its own, yet together they formed the invisible foundation upon which survival rested. Many of the women's faces revealed quiet concern, their brows furrowed, their eyes flicking often toward the hunters who would soon depart. A whispered prayer slipped from one woman's lips as she tied a bundle of provisions, asking the gods to guide the hunters safely and return them with abundance. Elders sat outside their homes, their bodies wrapped thickly against the chill, their hands knotted and worn with age, rested on carved walking sticks, while their eyes followed every movement with deep awareness. They had seen this ritual many times before, the gathering, the preparing, the waiting. They knew what success meant, and they knew too well the weight of failure. From their lips came stories told quietly to grandchildren, who crowded at their feet, tales of past hunts of great beasts slain, of times when a single victory brought salvation to all. The children listened, wide-eyed, caught between fear and wonder, the glow of the elders' words settling into their young minds like embers into ash. The men of the village, those not joining the hunt, busied themselves with tools and defenses. Some repaired roofs or tightened bindings on fishing nets, keeping their hands occupied while their minds wandered to thoughts of those about to leave. Others gathered wood for the fires, piling it high in readiness for the feast they all hoped would come. Their movements were purposeful, but a quiet tension clung to them, a recognition that their efforts mattered little if the hunt did not succeed. In the center of the village stood a wooden post carved with runes, a marker of faith and tradition. Here some paused to touch the carvings, whispering appeals to the gods for fortune, Odin the all-seeing, Frey, the giver of harvests and fertility, and Thor the protector with his hammer. Each name carried weight, each plea was a hope cast into the unseen realm. It was a reminder that the hunt was not only a test of human skill, but a negotiation with forces greater than themselves. As preparations continued, the hunters gathered near the water. Their presence was magnetic, drawing the eyes of every villager. They stood tall, some adjusting belts, others checking the edge of spears or the string of bows. Their cloaks, fur-lined and weather-stained, rippled in the morning breeze. Conversation between them was sparse, spoken in low tones, for words felt heavy in such moments. They knew what awaited, and they bore the knowledge with quiet resolve. The children crept closer, some daring to touch the spears, or gaze wide-eyed at the hunters' faces. They imagined themselves grown, strong and fearless, standing in this same place one day. The women lingered nearby, pressing food into hands, offering last-minute reminders, sometimes reaching up to adjust a cloak or brush a strand of hair from a face. Their touches were small but filled with meaning, gestures of care, of hope, of unspoken fears, hidden behind steady eyes. Time seemed to stretch. The sun climbed higher, its weak rays glinting on the ripples of the fjord, yet the village itself felt suspended, caught between the ordinary and the extraordinary. It was a moment that repeated itself across generations, yet never lost its weight. Every man, woman and child felt it. The thin line between scarcity and survival rested now on the shoulders of those who would step beyond the village boundaries. Waiting then was not passive, it was its own labor, filled with anxiety, hope, and silent endurance. For those who remained behind, the day ahead would be long. They would busy themselves with tasks, keep fires lit, prepare spaces for meat to be salted, dried, or cooked, tasks that were necessary, but that did little to ease the pressing thought: would the hunters return with enough? Would the gods be generous, or would hardship descend upon them once again? And so the village braced itself. Children played, but paused often to glance toward the horizon. Women worked, but whispered prayers beneath their breath. Elders spoke softly, weaving memory into present time. Men who stayed behind, kept busy with labor, though their ears remained tuned to the distant forest or the far-off sea. Every heart beat in rhythm with the same hope, that when the hunters returned, they would carry not only food but life itself back into the village. The air was filled with anticipation, thick and unshakable. It was more than waiting for hunters. It was waiting for fate. The outcome of the day would shape the nights ahead, would determine whether laughter or sorrow echoed through these narrow lanes. And so the village waited, as villages had always waited, with breath held, eyes turned outward, and prayers whispered into the wind. Hilda, hunters gathered at the edge of the village, where the land met the water and the forest paths stretched outward like veins into the wilderness. The morning mist still clung low, softening the shapes of men and boats, making the moment feel distant and eternal, as though it belonged not just to this day, but to all the days that had come before. Each hunter stood with purpose, adjusting belts, testing weapons, and checking provisions. They were not merely men about to set out on a task, they were the guardians of their people, entrusted with the weight of survival. Their preparation began long before this morning. Weapons were sharpened in quiet hours by firelight, blades drawn across whetstones with steady rhythmic strokes. Spears were inspected, shafts checked for cracks, points hardened in the flames, polished until they gleamed faintly. Bows were strung, their cords tested for tension, while arrows were counted carefully, each one tipped with iron or bone. Every tool, every weapon, had to be flawless, for a single failure in the wild could mean disaster. The hunters treated these instruments not as objects, but as companions, as lifelines. Armor was minimal, heavy metal would slow them down, and in the dense forests or on rocking boats, speed was more valuable than defense. Instead, they wore layers of wool and fur, thick enough to protect against cold and branches, light enough to allow movement. Some strapped on leather jerkins, their surfaces worn smooth by years of use. Around their waists hung knives in sheaths, tools for both combat and necessity. To the casual eye they might have seemed underprotected, yet in truth they were perfectly adapted for the world they faced. But the preparation was not only physical, it was spiritual. Before the hunt, men often stood before the carved wooden posts that bore runes of the gods. Here they placed hands upon the rough grain, murmuring prayers to Odin for wisdom, to Thor for strength, to Frey for abundance. Some tied charms of bone or carved amulets to their belts, tokens passed down from fathers and grandfathers who had survived their own hunts. The act of hunting was not seen as mere survival, it was part of the sacred order of life, a bond between humans, animals, and gods. One of the older hunters, a man with a long beard streaked in grey, knelt briefly on the cold earth before standing tall again. His movements were solemn, deliberate. Younger hunters watched him silently, copying his reverence. This was tradition, a passing of behavior from one generation to the next. Every hunt carried within it the memory of all hunts before, just as every new hunter carried within him the echoes of those who had once stood in his place. The atmosphere among them was quiet, but it was not the silence of fear, it was focus, a narrowing of thought, a readiness that came from knowing how much depended on what was to come. Words were unnecessary. A nod between men, the tightening of a strap, the testing of a spear's balance, these small gestures were communication enough. They trusted one another, each man knowing the strengths and habits of the others, their movements woven together by years of shared labor and danger. Behind the hunters stood the villagers, their presence both supportive and heavy. Wives and mothers adjusted cloaks, smoothing fur over shoulders, tying knots with firm, practiced hands. Children looked on with wide eyes, their small fingers reaching out to touch spears or bows before being gently pulled back. The elders watched from their seats, eyes narrowed, reading every detail, as though the outcome might already be written in the hunter's postures and expressions. This was a communal act, not just the departure of a few. Every soul in the village felt part of this preparation. The hunters carried not only weapons and provisions, but also tools of necessity, ropes coiled neatly at their sides, flint stones for fire, small pouches of salt for preserving meat if the gods were generous. Some carried nets, others hooks or harpoons, depending on whether the day's quarry would be sought in forest or sea. Their packs were modest, for weight was an enemy. Every item was chosen with care, balanced between need and burden. As the sun lifted higher, light spilling across the fjord, the hunters gathered in a circle. Their leader, a man known for both skill and wisdom, spoke softly. His words carried on the cold morning air. He reminded them of the importance of unity, of patience, of courage. His voice was steady, calm, but beneath it lay the gravity of truth. The hunt was no guarantee. Success was never promised, yet their skill, their preparation, and their will gave them the best chance of returning with abundance. The men listened in silence, each word sinking into them like iron hammered into steel. When he finished, there was no cheer, no loud cry of confidence. Instead, the hunters placed hands on one another's shoulders, a quiet gesture of brotherhood. It was not noise that gave strength, but trust. Then with slow movements, they turned toward the path ahead. The village fell even quieter as the moment of departure drew near. The women's eyes glistened, though they held their emotions steady, unwilling to let fear weaken the resolve of those they loved. Children clutched at skirts or cloaks, sensing the seriousness of the moment. Even the dogs of the village grew still, their heads tilting, ears pricked, as if they too understood the weight of the day. One by one, the hunters stepped forward, their boots pressing into the damp soil. The sound was muted, yet it carried immense meaning. Each footfall was a choice, a commitment. They carried no illusion of ease, but they carried determination, sharpened as keenly as the blades at their sides. Preparation was now complete. What lay ahead was uncertainty, the vast forest, the open sea, the strength of the beasts, the will of the gods. Yet in their preparation, in sharpened steel, in whispered prayers, in steady hands, there was power. And with that power, they stepped forward, leaving behind the safety of the village, moving into the unknown. The fjord, the mountains and the mist seemed to watch them go, silent witnesses to a ritual as old as humanity itself, the moment when hunters, carrying the hopes of many, walk into danger so that life may continue. The hunters moved away from the village with steady steps, their boots pressing into damp soil, leaving faint tracks behind them. The air was sharp and cold, filled with the scents of pine and salt, carrying the distant echo of waves that struck against the fjord's rocky edges. Behind them, the village grew smaller, its sounds fading into silence. Ahead lay the wilderness, vast, unpredictable, and alive with both danger and promise. The moment of departure carried weight. It was no longer talk, no longer preparation. Now the hunt had truly begun. The path wound first through a thicket of evergreens, their tall trunks rising like pillars into the pale morning sky. Mist clung to the lower branches, drifting across the hunters' cloaks as they passed, wrapping them in a shifting veil. Their breaths rose in faint clouds, mingling with the haze. The forest was hushed, yet not empty. The faint rustle of wings, the crack of a twig, the scurry of small creatures under brush, all whispered of hidden life. The hunters moved quietly, their senses sharpened, every sound amplified in the silence. One carried a bow, ready in his hands, an arrow nocked but not drawn. Another gripped his spear firmly, the polished tip glinting faintly as it caught a sliver of sunlight breaking through the canopy. Each man knew his role. Their movements were practiced, not hurried, but purposeful, as though they had rehearsed this ritual countless times. They had no need for chatter. Their communication flowed through nods, glances, the simple rhythm of shared experience. As the trees thickened, light dimmed, shafts of pale gold cut through gaps in the branches, creating shifting patterns on the ground. Moss softened their steps, muffling the sound of boots against earth. Above, a raven's call echoed, deep and hollow, its black form circling before vanishing into the distance. The Vikings regarded such birds as omens. Some believed ravens were Odin's eyes, watching, guiding, testing. The hunters did not ignore the sight. They glanced upward, acknowledging silently before continuing deeper. The terrain changed as they moved further inland. Hills rose gently, covered in tangled undergrowth. Streams cut through the earth, their waters icy, fed by snowmelt from the mountains. The hunters crossed them carefully, balancing on stones slick with moss, their reflections flickering across the rippling surface. The air here carried the scent of wet soil, mingled with the faint sweetness of distant blossoms. Clinging stubbornly against the cold, every step reminded them that this was not their world alone. They were visitors in a realm ruled by beasts, weather and gods. The leader raised a hand, signaling for silence and stillness. The group froze instantly. Ahead, a rustling carried through the trees, distinct from the smaller noises of birds or squirrels. It was deeper, heavier, the sound of something larger moving. Hearts beat a fraction faster. Hands tightened on weapons. The hunters waited, poised, listening intently, but the sound faded, replaced again by stillness. Perhaps it was only the wind, or perhaps it was the very quarry they sought, moving somewhere out of sight. The forest kept its secrets well. They pressed onward, slower now, their eyes scanning the ground. Tracks told stories here. The split hooves of deer pressed into soft mud, the rounded prints of wild boar, the faint trail of fox or hare. Each sign was studied carefully, judged for freshness, for direction. The hunters moved like readers of an ancient book, deciphering the marks left upon the earth. One knelt, brushing his fingers lightly over a deep impression, nodding to the others. The hunt was close. The forest stretched on, timeless and vast. Yet, even as hours passed, the men showed no weariness. Hunting was endurance as much as skill, and endurance they possessed in abundance. They ate little, drank sparingly, conserving strength. Each pause was brief, each moment of rest, purposeful. They were not here to wander. They were here to find, to pursue, to bring back what the village needed. Every step carried not only their own lives, but the lives of all who waited by the ford. As they climbed a rise, the view opened for a moment. The forest fell away into a wide valley, where sunlight spilled freely. A river curved through it, its waters gleaming like liquid silver, moving swiftly between banks lined with reeds and willows. The valley seemed quiet, untouched, yet filled with possibility. The hunters paused, scanning carefully. Here was land where great animals might roam, where herds crossed in search of grazing, where predators stalked unseen. The sight brought both anticipation and caution. They descended slowly, spreading out to cover more ground. The air grew warmer in the open valley, the scents richer, grass, flowers, the faint musk of animals, carried on the wind. Every sense was alive now. The sound of insects hummed faintly. A distant howl echoed from somewhere deeper in the woods, a reminder that wolves too hunted these lands. The hunters exchanged brief glances, acknowledging the presence of rivals. Still they pressed on, moving with the patience that the hunt demanded. Hours stretched, marked only by the slow passage of the sun overhead. Shadows lengthened, light softened, and still they searched. Their silence became meditative, their footsteps rhythmic, their thoughts narrowed to the present moment. The wilderness required this focus. To be distracted was to invite danger. At last signs began to gather, broken branches where something heavy had passed, fresh prints in soft soil, deep and clear, droppings still warm. The hunters crouched, examining, nodding to one another with controlled excitement. Their quarry was near, muscles tightened, breaths slowed. This was the moment where vigilance turned into readiness, where every nerve prepared for the possibility of sudden pursuit. The leader raised his hand again, this time directing them into positions. They spread into a loose formation, careful not to reveal themselves. Step by step, they advanced, every movement deliberate, every sound minimized. The forest seemed to notice. Birds grew silent. Even the wind paused, as though holding still for what was about to unfold. The hunt had begun, not in noise or chaos, but in silence and patience. It was a game of presence, of reading the land, of knowing when to move and when to wait. The Vikings understood this well. They were not strangers to hardship. They were shaped by it, molded into hunters who could endure the long hours, the slow stalking, the testing of their will against the cunning of beasts. As the shadows deepened, and the first hints of dusk tinged the horizon, the hunters pressed further into the valley, their bodies tired, yet their spirits sharpened. Every sense was alive, every heart beat stronger, every step carrying them closer to the moment when silence would break into action. The wilderness had opened its gates, and the hunters were now within it, part of its endless rhythm. The hunt had truly begun. The signs on the ground grew fresher, clearer, unmistakable. The hunters knew what they were following now. These were no ordinary tracks of small deer or scattered boar. They were larger, deeper, pressed into the soft soil, with a weight that spoke of great size and strength. The men paused around the impression, crouching low, running their fingers gently across its edges, as though touching something sacred. It was an elk. The great elk was among the most prized creatures of the northern forests, a beast whose massive antlers could spread wider than a man's outstretched arms, whose body could outweigh 3 or 4 hunters combined. To see one was rare, to capture one rarer still, but such a creature, if brought down, could feed an entire village for many weeks. Its meat was rich and abundant, its hide thick enough to fashion cloaks, its antlers carved into tools, ornaments, and weapons. The elk was not only a source of food, it was a symbol of fortune, of divine favor. The hunters exchanged glances, their eyes alight with a controlled fire. They had come in search of game, but to find signs of an elk was beyond what they had dared to hope. For a moment the air seemed to hum with possibility. This was no longer a simple hunt. This was destiny calling from the shadows of the forest. The leader rose, scanning the path ahead. Branches were broken at chest height, snapped by the sheer force of the elk's passage. Tufts of coarse fur clung to bark where it had brushed past. The trail moved steadily toward the open valley, cutting through thickets and across shallow streams. The animal was moving with purpose, perhaps seeking grazing grounds, perhaps moving toward water. Whatever its aim, the hunters would follow. They adjusted their pace, slower, more deliberate, for this was no ordinary pursuit. To chase too quickly risked spooking the elk, sending it fleeing deep into the wilderness, where even the most skilled tracker might lose it. Instead, the men became shadows, blending with trees, melting into brush, advancing with patience carved from years of practice. As they moved, the leader's thoughts turned inward. He remembered tales told by elders of hunts long past, of warriors who faced elk and failed, trampled under hooves, cast aside like dry twigs. The beast was no mere prey, it was a challenge from the wild itself, demanding respect, caution, and strategy. To underestimate it was to court disaster. To approach it correctly was to win a prize that could alter the fate of the entire village. The group came to a halt as one of the hunters raised his hand. He had spotted something ahead. Through the shifting veil of branches and leaves, a shape moved, large, graceful, powerful. The elk stepped into sight. It emerged from the shadows of the forest into a clearing, bathed in soft golden light. Its antlers crowned its head like the branches of an ancient tree, sprawling and intricate, catching the last rays of the descending sun. Its coat was a deep brown, flecked with lighter shades that glimmered in the light. Muscles rippled beneath its hide as it moved with a steady, unhurried gait, lowering its head to graze on tender shoots sprouting between stones. The hunters stilled, breath caught in their throats. To behold such a creature in its full majesty was to witness the wild in its purest form. For a long moment, none of them moved. They simply watched, absorbing the sight, the enormity of what stood before them. The elk raised its head, ears twitching, its dark eyes scanned the clearing, sharp and alert. It sniffed the air, nostrils flaring, testing the scents carried on the wind. The hunters remained frozen, pressed low, hidden by brush. The slightest sound, the faintest shift could betray them. Their hearts beat steady but strong, the weight of silence thick around them. Minutes stretched like hours. The elk grazed, lifted its head, turned slowly, moved a few paces, then stilled again. Every motion carried elegance, strength and tension. It was a creature born of wild power, a spirit of the forest given flesh and bone. To face it was to step into an ancient dance between man and nature, one played out for generations beyond memory. The hunters whispered silently with their eyes, exchanging signals. They must plan carefully. A beast of such size could not be rushed. If it bolted, it could vanish into the forest in moments, leaving only empty tracks behind. They needed to strike with precision, to surround it, to time their move with flawless unity. The leader's gaze swept across the clearing. He noted the slope of the land, the direction of the wind, the cover of trees, the shadows lengthening with dusk. Every detail mattered. He motioned to two hunters, sending them wide to the flanks, to position themselves unseen, to cut off escape routes. Others remained close, ready to advance when the signal came. Slowly, silently, they moved, blending into the shifting colors of evening. The elk shifted again, ears twitching. It sensed something, perhaps the faintest rustle of leaves, perhaps nothing at all. Its head lifted sharply, antlers cutting against the sky like blackened branches. The hunters froze mid-step, bodies pressed low. The elk sniffed, turned slightly, then lowered its head once more. The moment of tension passed, but it was a warning. They had but one chance to do this right. From their positions, the hunters studied their quarry, weighing their weapons against the task before them. The archer knew he would need to place his arrow with absolute precision, striking in the space between shoulder and chest, where hide was thinner. The spearmen knew they would need to close the distance quickly, driving their weapons with force enough to pierce. Each man measured his courage, steadying his breath, preparing for the test to come. But beyond tactics and weapons lay something greater: reverence. The Vikings did not see the elk as mere flesh to be taken. It was a gift from the wild, a living spirit of the land. To kill it was not only survival, but ceremony. They would take its life with respect, and in return it would give life to the many. Such was the bond between man and nature in these ancient times. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with streaks of fire and gold, the elk lifted its head once more. Its silhouette burned against the fading light, an image that would etch itself forever into memory. The hunters, crouched in shadow, felt the weight of destiny pressing closer. The prey had been chosen. The stage was set. Soon silence would break into storm, and the fate of the hunt would be sealed. The moment of stillness broke in a single heartbeat. The elk raised its head once more, ears flicking sharply, eyes narrowing as if it had finally sensed what lingered at the edges of the clearing. A faint shift of the wind betrayed the hunters. The beast inhaled, and its body stiffened. Time seemed to freeze, just long enough for every man to understand what was about to happen. Then, with an explosion of power, the elk bolted. Its hooves struck the earth like thunder, kicking up dirt and fallen leaves as it launched forward. The ground trembled beneath its weight. Its antlers, vast and branching, tore through low branches as it surged into the underbrush. The serene forest, moments ago wrapped in golden quiet, was torn open with the raw sound of pursuit. The hunters sprang from their cover. No hesitation, no delay. Every muscle moved as if commanded by instinct, honed over generations. This was the moment they had been born and trained for. The chase, the test, the dance between man and beast. The leader's voice rang low but urgent. Now, his words cut through the chaos like steel. The men surged into motion, their boots thudding softly against the forest floor, their bodies weaving between trees, their eyes fixed on the fleeing shadow of antlers ahead. The elk ran with astonishing grace, weaving through the forest, leaping fallen logs, splashing through shallow streams. Its body was a symphony of power and survival, every motion designed to outrun and outlast pursuers. Yet the hunters were not easily shaken. They had trained for this, running with steady breath, pacing themselves, conserving strength, even as they pushed harder. The forest became a blur of shapes and sounds. Branches whipped at their faces, the ground rose and fell, the air grew sharp and cool with the coming of dusk. They leapt roots, ducked branches and pressed on, their focus never breaking. Ahead, the elk crashed through the undergrowth, the sound of its passage both a guide and a taunt. For the hunters, this was not just about speed, it was about strategy. The elk was faster in bursts, but the men could endure. They could chase longer, pace themselves, outlast the animal's wild rush. It was a battle of stamina, of patience, of knowing when to push and when to wait. The leader signaled with hand gestures as he ran, directing men to spread wide, to form a living net that would close around the prey. The chase stretched on, carrying them deeper into the wild. The light of day dwindled, shadows lengthened, and the forest grew thick with dim hues of twilight. Every sense sharpened, the smell of damp earth, the sound of cracking twigs, the flicker of movement ahead. Sweat beaded on foreheads, breath came in steady bursts, but still they ran. Suddenly the elk broke from the tree line into a broader clearing, where grass spread in open sways. For an instant it looked magnificent, leaping high as though it had sprouted wings. Its antlers shone in the fading light, a crown of wild power against the crimson sky. Yet this open ground was dangerous for the beast. The hunters could see it clearly now, track its every move without obstruction. The archer raised his bow, drawing the string tight, his breath slowing, his focus narrowing to the single point of the beast's chest. He released. The arrow hissed through the air, slicing across the distance. The elk twisted at the last instant, the arrow grazing its flank instead of striking true. The beast bellowed, a sound deep and raw, both anger and defiance. Blood darkened its side, but it did not falter. If anything, the wound drove it to greater fury, greater flight. The hunters pressed on. The spearmen tightened their grip, their arms aching for the thrust, but the elk's speed kept it always just beyond reach. Still, the wound had changed the rhythm of the chase. The elk's steps grew uneven, its pace fierce but strained. The men saw this, and hope surged in their hearts. They had drawn first blood. The balance was shifting. The elk veered sharply, plunging back into the forest. The hunters followed, ducking into shadows where the canopy thickened, and the light nearly vanished. Here in the darkening wood, every sound was magnified. The crash of branches, the thunder of hooves, the steady drum of pursuit. One hunter stumbled, his foot catching on a hidden root. He fell hard, rolling into the brush, but another pulled him up without breaking stride. There was no time for weakness, no room for hesitation. The hunt bound them together, each man driving the other forward. The elk burst through a shallow stream, sending water spraying into the dusk. The hunters splashed after, the cold biting their legs, but they pressed on. The animal's breaths grew harsher, visible in the cool evening air. Its strength was vast but not infinite. Already the wound slowed it. Already the chase had begun to carve away its reserves. The leader's mind worked tirelessly. He marked the beast's path, the terrain it chose, the obstacles it avoided. He knew the elk's instincts, its patterns, its likely decisions. He began to steer his men, signaling them toward where the animal must turn, cutting its options one by one. This was more than pursuit. It was strategy layered upon instinct, knowledge handed down from ancestors who had chased elk long before these men were born. At last the forest opened again, this time onto rocky ground. Jagged stones jutted up from the earth, uneven and treacherous. The elk bounded across them with practiced ease, its hooves striking sparks in the gloom. The hunters slowed, cautious, their balance tested with each step. Here the beast gained distance, leaping higher, surging faster, yet blood still trailed faintly on the stones, a crimson thread that marked its passage. Night deepened, the sky turned to dark indigo, stars beginning to glitter faintly through gaps in the trees, but the chase did not falter. The hunters pressed on by moonlight, their quarry still ahead, its shadow flickering between boulders and brush. Then came the sound they had been waiting for, a stumble. The elk, weary and wounded, misstepped upon the stones. Its stride faltered, its body lurched sideways. Though it regained footing, the stumble cost it precious seconds. The hunters seized the moment, surging forward, narrowing the gap. The beast sensed the tightening circle, and its breath came in ragged bursts. Still it fought on, still it ran with the primal will to survive. The leader signaled sharply, the men fanned wider, their formation tightening, their net closing. Each hunter now felt the rhythm of the chase pulsing within them, their breaths aligned, their feet pounding in unison, their eyes fixed on the great beast ahead. The forest, the night, the very world seemed to narrow to this single pursuit, this sacred test of endurance and will. The elk leapt one final ridge, crashing down into a hollow filled with shadow. The hunters followed, their bodies aching, their lungs burning, but their spirits aflame. They could feel the nearness of the end. The beast's strength waned, their own resolve sharpened. The ancient dance had reached its peak. For a moment silence seemed to fall again, just as it had before the chase began. The elk stood in the hollow, sides heaving, head high, antlers spread like the arms of a god. It turned to face them, no longer fleeing, but defiant, a wild king refusing to bow. Its breath steamed in the cold air, its eyes gleamed with fire. The hunters circled, weapons ready, hearts steady. The chase had brought them here, to this final standoff, man and beast, hunter and hunted, bound in the oldest story of survival. The forest held its breath. The night waited, the dance was not yet finished. The hollow seemed to close in on itself, as though the forest had drawn a curtain around this moment. Above, the sky was dark now, flecked with faint stars. The moon cast pale silver light through gaps in the trees, touching the elk's antlers until they glowed like weapons forged of bone and starlight. The hunters slowed their pace, their circle tightening. Every step was deliberate, silent despite the pounding of their hearts. Their breaths came heavy, yet controlled, each man balancing exhaustion with the precision the moment demanded. The chase had burned away their fear, their doubt. Now only clarity remained. The elk stood tall, though its sides heaved with effort. Blood streaked its flank, matting fur, dripping slowly onto the soil. Its nostrils flared, pulling in the cold night air, exhaling clouds of vapor like smoke from a forge. Its eyes glimmered not with panic, but with something older, pride, defiance, the raw refusal of a creature that had never bowed to anything but death itself. For a heartbeat no one moved. The men and the beast faced each other, joined in a silence so thick it seemed almost sacred. Then the leader raised his spear. It was not a gesture of haste, but of ceremony. He lifted the weapon with both hands, angling it toward the sky, letting the moonlight touch its sharpened tip. His men watched, understanding the meaning. This was not just a kill, it was the fulfillment of an ancient pact. the hunter giving respect to the hunted, acknowledging the life that would end so others could live. The elk pawed the ground, a low rumbling sound vibrating in its chest. It lowered its head, antlers spreading wide, preparing for the charge. The hunters braced. The hollow became the stage for the final clash. With a cry torn from deep within, the elk lunged forward. Its hooves struck sparks from the rocky soil, its body surging with what strength remained. The ground shook beneath its weight. Antlers lowered like a storm of branches. It bore down upon the leader. He did not retreat. Instead, he stepped aside with practiced speed, the motion fluid, rehearsed 1,000 times. His spear thrust forward, swift as lightning, aimed for the space behind the shoulder. The tip struck true, sinking deep into muscle and flesh. The elk roared in pain, twisting violently, almost wrenching the weapon from his hands. The men surged in. Another spear darted forward, striking low. The archer, bow abandoned now, drew his knife and leapt into the fray. The hollow erupted into sounds, shouts of men, cries of the beast, the clash of antler against wood, hoof against earth. The elk fought like a king unseated, refusing to fall. Its antlers swept wide, knocking one hunter aside. A hoof lashed out, striking another man in the thigh, and sending him sprawling. Still the hunters pressed closer. Their formation, honed through countless hunts, never fully broke. Each man knew his place, his duty, his part in the circle that now tightened with every heartbeat. Spears struck again and again, glancing off bone, sinking into flesh. Blood slicked the ground, dark and gleaming in the moonlight. The elk's strength faltered, its breaths came ragged, wheezing, its legs trembling beneath the strain, yet it stood tall, refusing to collapse. Its eyes blazed with something unbroken. The leader advanced once more, his spear still lodged in the beast's side. With a swift motion, he twisted the shaft, driving it deeper, piercing the vital place where life beats strongest. The elk staggered, its roar turned to a choking gasp. Its legs buckled, then locked again, holding it upright for one last defiant moment. The hollow grew still as all watched. The elk lifted its head, antlers catching the moonlight like a crown. For the briefest breath, it seemed more than an animal. It seemed a spirit of the forest itself, proud, untamed, eternal. Then slowly, its body gave way. The great beast collapsed onto the soil. The sound was deep, final, a thud that seemed to echo in the bones of every man present. Dust and leaves swirled around its body as silence reclaimed the hollow. The hunters lowered their weapons. No one spoke. The leader approached the fallen elk. He knelt beside it, placing one hand on its flank. Feeling the last tremors fade from muscle, the warmth that would soon leave, he bowed his head. The others did the same, a gesture of reverence, of gratitude. They did not cheer, they did not boast. The moment demanded respect. The leader whispered a prayer, the words old as the stones beneath their feet. He gave thanks, for the life taken, for the strength granted, for the bond between man and beast that ensured the survival of both. His voice was steady, but there was weight in it, as though he carried not just his own gratitude, but that of all his people. The hunters began their solemn work. They moved with care, with ritual, each man knowing the steps as if taught by memory older than his own. They bound the legs of the elk, prepared branches to carry it, and kept silence as they worked. Their movements were deliberate, not hurried. This was not simply meat to be gathered. It was an offering, a blessing. The forest seemed to acknowledge the act. The night air stilled, the sounds of distant creatures quieted, even the wind slowed its whisper through the branches. For this moment, all things bowed to the passing of the elk. As the men lifted their burden, the leader looked once more upon the fallen beast. He spoke softly, words carried into the night. You ran with fire, you fought with honor, your spirit joins the forest, but your body will keep our people strong. For this we remember you. The others murmured assent. Together they began the long walk back to their camp, carrying the elk with them. Behind them the hollow lay silent, the earth marked with blood, the air heavy with memory. The moonlight lingered on the ground where the elk had fallen, as though unwilling to let the moment pass into shadow. The hunt was over, the kill had come. Yet what remained was not triumph, but reverence, a reminder that in the endless dance of predator and prey, every ending carried weight, every life demanded respect. The forest, timeless and vast, closed once more around the men as they departed, holding within its depths the echo of the elk's final cry. The path back to the village wound through forest and field, a ribbon of earth stamped by countless journeys before. Yet tonight, under the dim glow of the moon, it felt different, weighted, sacred. The hunters carried their burden with measured steps, the elk's immense body stretched across poles of ash wood, each man's shoulder pressed beneath the weight. Though sweat clung to their brows and their muscles burned with exhaustion, no one faltered. The silence between them was not the silence of fatigue, but of reverence. Every step echoed with meaning. They were not merely carrying an animal, they were carrying the promise of survival, the assurance of warmth and strength for their people through the bitter days that lay ahead. The elk was heavy, yet within that heaviness, there was honor. The forest gave way slowly, trees thinned, their skeletal branches reaching overhead, like the ribs of a giant hall. The hunters passed through shadows and silver pools of moonlight, each patch of ground a stage for their solemn procession, their breath fogged in the cold air, rising in soft white plumes that drifted upward and vanished into the night. The leader walked at the front, his hand steady on the pole, his eyes remained forward, but his thoughts were behind, on the clash in the hollow, on the moment when the elk's final cry had shivered through the air. He felt its echo still within him. There was no joy in victory, only the calm knowledge that the balance of life had been kept. As they neared the open land, faint lights flickered in the distance. The village, small fires burned at the edges of the dwellings, their glow like scattered stars fallen to earth. The hunters saw them and felt a quiet lift in their chests. Home, behind those walls their families waited. Behind those fires children dreamed, women kept watch, elders whispered prayers into the dark. The sound of the burdened steps carried ahead of them. Dry grass crunched beneath boots. The poles creaked under strain. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of smoke and hearth fires. It was the smell of safety, of belonging. As the hunters drew closer, shadows stirred along the outskirts of the village. Shapes emerged, figures rushing from the glow of firelight, their faces anxious, searching. The women were first, cloaks drawn tightly around their shoulders, eyes straining through the dark. Behind them came the elders, leaning on staffs, and then the children, who ran barefoot across the cold earth despite the calls to wait. The hunters did not speak, they let the sight itself carry their message. Gasps filled the night as the villagers saw the antlers, vast and gleaming even in the pale light. Murmurs spread like wind through tall grass. Astonishment, relief, reverence. Children clutched their mothers' hands, their eyes wide with wonder at the sheer size of the beast their fathers had brought back. The leader raised his head, meeting the gaze of the villagers. He did not smile, but there was a calm pride in his eyes. His steps slowed, and the others followed, carrying the elk toward the heart of the settlement. There, in the central clearing, the people gathered in a wide circle. Fires burned brighter, casting tall shadows that danced along the walls of huts. The elk was lowered gently to the ground, its body laid out with care. The hunters straightened, shoulders aching, but stood tall before their people. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the crackle of flames, the soft rustle of cloaks in the night air. The elk's body gleamed with moonlight and firelight alike, as if the forest itself had followed it here. Then slowly the villagers began to kneel. One by one they bent their heads in silence. The women whispered thanks, the children touched their foreheads to the earth. The elders raised their hands skyward, murmuring words of prayer, their voices weaving together in a low, steady chant. The leader stepped forward. He placed his palm upon the elk's brow, fingers spread as though blessing the fallen creature. His voice carried clearly, though it was soft. This life was taken not for glory, but for all of us. We honor the spirit of the elk, who gave its strength so that our children may eat, so that our fires may burn, so that our people may endure. The chant of the elders deepened, flowing like a river beneath his words. The people echoed him in whispers. We honor. The leader continued. This hunt was not ours alone. It was the forest that gave us its path. It was the ancestors who guided our steps. And it was the elk who gave us its final gift. Let none forget what has been done here. Again the whispers came. We remember. The people bowed their heads, the air thick with gratitude, with the weight of shared survival. Even the children, restless moments before, sat in silence, their eyes wide as if they sensed the sacredness of the moment. The hunters stepped back, allowing the women to come forward. Carefully, reverently, they began the preparations. Knives flashed in the firelight, not as tools of violence, but of service. Each cut was deliberate, each movement respectful. Portions of the elk would be set aside for ritual, others for the feast, others stored carefully against the winter to come. Nothing would be wasted. Bones would become tools, hide would become warmth, sinew would become thread. The life of the elk would weave itself into every corner of their survival. The people watched, the fires crackling louder now, the air filled with the mingling scents of smoke, blood, and earth. Yet there was no harshness in it, only a sense of rightness. This was the cycle, the eternal rhythm that bound them all. The hunters stood apart, weary but at peace. They watched as their people began to stir with relief, as children smiled again, as women exchanged quiet glances of gratitude. The elders' chants softened into prayerful murmurs, a blessing carried into the night sky. The leader lifted his eyes to the stars. He saw them burning, cold and steady above, indifferent yet eternal. He thought of the elk, proud and fierce to the last, and of the generations before who had walked this same path, carried this same burden, spoken these same words. In that thought he found comfort. He was part of something endless. Around him the village moved gently, reverently, in rhythm with the fire and the stars. The return was complete. The hunters had brought not just food, but hope, unity, and the memory of a sacred bond renewed. The night deepened, but within the circle of firelight, the people felt safe. The forest waited beyond, vast and shadowed, but for now, there was warmth, there was light, and there was life. The elk had been brought into the heart of the village, its spirit honored, its body prepared with reverence. Now, as the work of dividing and storing was complete, the settlement began to stir with anticipation for what was to come. A feast was not only about food, it was about memory, about community, about the telling of stories that bound the people together like threads in a great woven cloth. The fires burned high, their flames licking upward into the dark sky. Sparks floated like fleeting stars, carried on the wind before disappearing into the night. Around the flames the villagers gathered, cloaked against the cold, their faces glowing in the firelight. Children shuffled close to the warmth, their laughter like small bells, while the elders settled carefully onto carved wooden stools, their eyes deep with the knowledge of many winters. The hunters, weary from their journey, sat in a place of quiet honor. Their shoulders ached, their arms bore the marks of strain, yet there was a calmness to them, a peace that came only when duty had been fulfilled. They did not seek recognition, but it was given to them all the same through the glances of gratitude, through the whispers of thanks, through the simple presence of their people gathered together in joy. As the feast began, the smell of roasted elk filled the air, meat turned on spits, juices dripping into the flames with a hiss that sent fragrant smoke swirling upward. Women carried platters of steaming portions, their movements sure and practiced. The first cuts were offered to the elders, who accepted with solemn nods, lifting their food as if in silent toast to the spirit of the animal. After them, the hunters received their share, a token of gratitude for the strength and risk they had given. Then at last, the children, whose bright eyes widened at the sight of abundance, received their pieces, giggling as the taste warmed their tongues. The clearing was alive with sound, the crackle of fire, the murmur of voices, the occasional burst of laughter. It was not just eating, it was communion. Each bite was a reminder that survival was shared, that life itself was something too great for one person to carry alone. When bellies were warm and hunger eased, the next part of the night began storytelling. It always began with the elders. One of them, his hair silver and his hands gnarled with age, rose slowly from his seat. His eyes glimmered with firelight as he looked over the gathered faces. He carried no staff, no object to mark his authority. His presence alone was enough. He spoke softly at first, his voice carrying the rhythm of the wind in the trees, the measured cadence of a drumbeat heard from far away. The crowd hushed, children leaning against their mothers, hunters bowing their heads, all listening. He told of hunts long past, when ancestors walked these same forests and followed the same paths. He spoke of winters that had nearly broken the people, and of the hunts that had saved them. He spoke of elk greater than any seen today, with antlers like living trees, beasts that had tested the courage and skill of those who came before. His words painted pictures in the firelight, Shadows shifting on the ground seemed to move with his tales, becoming the very figures of those long-gone ancestors. The people listened not for entertainment alone, but for memory. Each story was more than a tale, it was instruction, a reminder, a lesson wrapped in words. The children learned what it meant to respect the hunt, the women recalled the endurance of their foremothers, and the hunters felt the weight of tradition settle upon their shoulders like a mantle. When the elder finished, silence lingered. The crackle of the fire filled the space he left behind, as though the flames themselves were repeating his words. Then another rose, this time a woman, her hair braided with beads that caught the light. She did not speak of hunts or battles, but of the elk itself. She told of its spirit, of how it moved through the forest like wind through grass, of how its eyes held the wisdom of the earth. She reminded the people that this animal, though slain, lived on within them, in their strength, in their warmth, in their very survival. Her words were like a soft blanket, wrapping the crowd in reverence and gratitude. Then came the children, encouraged to share their own voices. They spoke in shy tones at first, fumbling for words, yet the village listened with patience and warmth. A boy told of how he dreamed of one day joining the hunt, of walking where his father had walked. A girl spoke of the forest, of how she imagined the animals gathered beneath the moon, whispering to one another. Their words were simple, but they carried the spark of future memory, the promise that stories would continue long after the elders had gone. As the night deepened, voices rose and fell, weaving a tapestry of sound around the fire. Laughter mixed with solemn words, myth mingled with truth. Some tales were warnings, others were celebrations, some were filled with awe, others with gentle humor. Yet all shared the same heartbeat, the rhythm of a people, remembering who they were, where they had come from, and why they endured. The hunters, though tired, found themselves drawn into the stories. They saw their own footsteps echoed in the tales of past hunts. They felt the strength of the elk in their veins, as the woman's words lingered in the air. They smiled at the dreams of the children, seeing in them a future that stretched far beyond the present night. At last, when the stories had flowed like a river, and the flames had burned low, a hush fell upon the gathering. The leader of the hunters rose. His voice was not loud, but it carried the authority of one who had lived the very tale now woven into memory. He spoke of the hunt they had just returned from, of the path through the forest, of the clash in the hollow of the moment when life and death balanced on the edge of a spear. He did not embellish, nor did he linger on glory. Instead, he spoke with calm honesty, his words carrying the weight of truth. He reminded the people of the struggle, of the danger, of the courage required, not by one man, but by all who stood together. As he spoke, the crowd was silent. The fire crackled low, casting long shadows that seemed to lean closer to hear. The hunters at his side bowed their heads, remembering each moment with clarity. The people felt the story settle into their hearts, not as entertainment, but as shared experience, as something that belonged to all of them now. When he finished, he lifted his eyes to the stars above. His final words were simple: "This hunt will not be forgotten." The people echoed softly, "It will not." And in that moment, the feast and the stories became one. The food nourished their bodies, the tales nourished their spirits, and together they built something greater than either could alone: a memory, a legend, a binding thread that would carry them into the cold nights ahead. The fire burned low, embers glowing like scattered jewels. The people sat close, warm with food, wrapped in cloaks, lulled by stories. Sleep began to steal over them, gentle and inevitable, even as the words of the night lingered like echoes in the air. The feast had ended, but the storytelling continued in their dreams, weaving the memory of the elk, the hunters, and the village into the timeless fabric of who they were. The feast had nourished their bodies, and the stories had nourished their minds, yet there was still something deeper, something less visible, but more enduring, that held the people together. It was the spiritual meaning of the hunt, the invisible thread that wove their lives to the forest, to the animals, and to the great mysteries that move beyond human understanding. For the people, the elk was not only food, it was not only hide and bone. It was a being whose life had been given so that theirs could continue. They believed that every creature carried a spirit, a force unseen but deeply felt, that lingered long after the body had fallen. To take such a life was not a simple act. It was sacred. The village gathered again, this time in quiet reverence. The fires still glowed, though lower now, casting long and wavering shadows across the earth. In the silence one could hear the faint sound of the forest itself, the whisper of trees swaying in the night wind, the distant cry of an owl, the soft crackle of dying embers. It was in this space between sound and silence that the people turned their hearts toward the unseen. The shaman of the village, a figure wrapped in furs, stepped forward. Feathers adorned his braids, small bones rattled gently from his necklace, and his eyes gleamed with the reflection of the fire. He carried no weapon, no tool of the hunt, for his role was not in taking life but in honoring it. He knelt before the bones of the elk, which had been carefully laid out near the edge of the gathering. Each piece had been cleaned, placed with care, as if arranging a puzzle that spoke a language only the spirit world could fully understand. The skull, proud and heavy, still bore its antlers, rising like branches of a sacred tree. To the people, this was no mere remnant. It was a vessel of power, of memory, of connection to the eternal. The shaman began to chant, his voice low and steady, rising and falling like the breath of the earth itself. The words were older than any living member of the tribe, passed down through countless generations. They were not merely sounds but invocations to the spirit of the elk, calling it back, not in body, but in presence. The people closed their eyes. Some pressed their palms together, others rested their hands upon the earth. Children leaned against their mothers, lulled by the rhythm. Hunters bowed their heads, feeling once more the weight of the chase, the moment of release, the silence that followed when life shifted into death. The chant grew stronger, echoing into the night. It was said that in these moments, the spirit of the animal lingered close, circling the people, watching, listening. Some believed they could feel it brush against them like wind across their skin. Others believed they could see it in the flickering of the flames, a shape too fleeting to name, but too powerful to deny. When the shaman's voice softened again, he spoke in words clear to all. This elk, he said, did not fall by chance. It offered itself to us, as our ancestors taught us it would. Its spirit walks still, watching us, judging whether we honor its gift. If we take without gratitude, we lose balance. If we forget, we lose ourselves. But if we remember, if we respect, if we share, if we carry its strength within us with humility, then its spirit will walk beside us, and our people will live. A murmur of agreement moved through the crowd. Heads nodded. The hunters, their bodies still aching, felt a weight lift from their hearts. The elders' eyes shone with quiet pride, knowing that this teaching would not be lost. Even the children, though they did not fully understand, felt the solemn beauty of the words settle into their small growing souls. The shaman then took a small bowl of glowing embers from the fire. Into it he sprinkled dried herbs, and immediately a fragrant smoke rose upward, twisting into the cold night air. The scent was sharp and sweet, filling the lungs, clearing the mind. He carried the bowl around the gathering, letting each person breathe the smoke, touch it with their hands, draw it across their bodies. This was not merely ritual, it was a way of binding them all into the same circle, linking their breath to one another, linking their lives to the elk's spirit. At the end he returned to the bones, and set the bowl before the skull. The smoke curled upward, between the antlers, as though carrying prayers to the stars. The people lifted their eyes. Above them the sky stretched wide and endless, filled with constellations that they knew by heart. To them the stars were not distant, burning stones, they were the campfires of ancestors, the lights of spirits who watched and guided from beyond. Somewhere among them now, they believed the elk's spirit too had joined, glowing faintly in the eternal night. One of the elders spoke then, her voice soft but steady. Just as we are part of the forest, the elk too is part of us. Its body gives us life, but its spirit gives us strength. It teaches us humility, for we cannot live without the gifts of others. It teaches us gratitude, for what is given is never small, and it teaches us balance, for the taking of life demands respect for life. The silence that followed was heavy, not with sorrow but with meaning. Each person felt the truth of her words settle deep within them. They were reminded that survival was never just about strength or skill, it was about harmony, between human and animal, between body and spirit, between life and death. The hunters felt it most keenly. They had stood closest to the edge of that balance, had looked into the elk's dark eyes as the spear struck, had felt the weight of both triumph and loss in the same heartbeat. Now through ritual and words, that moment was transformed. It was no longer only a memory of taking life, it was a reminder of the sacred connection between all things. The flames flickered lower, the smoke drifted higher, and slowly the shaman's chant began again, softer now, like a lullaby sung to the earth. It carried the people into a state of peace, their eyes heavy, their breathing deep. The elk's spirit was with them, not as a shadow of sorrow, but as a guide, a guardian, a reminder that every life, every breath, every moment was part of something vast and eternal. In that stillness the people slept, and in their dreams the elk walked beside them, leading them not only through forests and across rivers, but through the unseen pathways of the soul. The rituals had ended, and silence once more settled upon the village. Yet the story of the elk did not end there, for its presence remained woven into every part of daily life. To the Vikings the cycle was never broken, it merely transformed. The hunt, the feast, the ritual, and the remembrance were all threads of one great pattern, a circle that continued without end. As dawn rose over the village, a pale light touched the frost that clung to rooftops and the tips of grass. The smoke from dying fires drifted upward in thin ribbons, carrying with it the lingering scents of roasted meat and sacred herbs. Men, women, and children emerged slowly from their long sleep, some stretching their arms toward the cold morning sky, others rubbing tired eyes, their minds still echoing with the chants of the night before. The hunters, though weary, were already at work. They cleaned and sharpened their tools, washed the blood from their hands, and stored their weapons with reverence. Their task was finished, but their duty was not. In their hearts they carried the memory of the elk's final gaze, the weight of responsibility that came with taking a life. It was a lesson that followed them into every hunt thereafter, reminding them that survival was not victory but balance. Women gathered the hides, stretching them taut across wooden frames to dry in the cold wind. These hides would soon become warm garments, sturdy boots and protective cloaks against the harsh northern winters. Each stitch, each cut, each careful fold of leather carried the quiet echo of gratitude. Children would wear these clothes, elders would sleep beneath them, and every family would remember the animal that had given its body for their comfort. Bones, too, found new life. Skilled hands carved them into tools, needles and handles for knives. Antlers were shaped into combs, ornaments, and even protective charms to be carried into battle. To discard such gifts would be unthinkable. Every piece of the elk was used, nothing wasted, for to waste was to dishonor both the animal and the gods who had allowed the hunt to succeed. Even the smallest scraps found purpose. Some were burned in the hearth, their smoke believed to carry whispers of thanks into the heavens. Others were buried deep within the earth, offerings to ensure the cycle of life would continue, that the forests would remain full, that the rivers would flow strong, and that future hunts would be blessed with abundance. The children, though too young to understand all the meanings, learned by watching, they saw their parents and elders work with quiet reverence. They felt the seriousness in the air, the patience with which each task was performed. Through these acts they absorbed the knowledge that survival was never a matter of greed, but of respect. The cycle of taking and giving was taught not through words alone, but through every gesture of daily life. As days passed, the feast became memory, and yet it was not forgotten. Around the fires the story of the great hunt was told again and again. The hunters spoke of the chase, of the strength of the animal, of the moment the spear struck true. The shaman spoke of the spirit that lingered, watching and guiding. The elders wove these words into lessons, reminding the young of their place in the world, of the delicate balance between human need and nature's gift. And so the cycle closed gently, not with an end, but with transformation. The elk was no longer only an animal of the forest, it had become clothing, tools, warmth, memory, and story. It had become part of the people themselves, woven into their very lives, their very breath. Its spirit walked with them in silence, reminding them with every step that life was sustained, not by force alone, but by gratitude, harmony, and care. In this way the people lived, in this way they endured, and in this way the cycle of the hunt continued, an endless circle of giving and receiving, of death and renewal, of body and spirit, binding the people forever to the land, the animals, and the mysteries that lay beyond the veil of the scene. The hunt, though long past, lived on in ways that reached far beyond the village fires and snowy forests. For the Vikings, the act of hunting was never simply about survival. It was a story passed down through generations, preserved in memory, in ritual, in song, and in the objects that remained long after the animal's life had ended. Each hunt became part of something larger, a legacy that shaped their culture and bound them together through time. When a child asked an elder where their warm cloak had come from, the elder did not merely say, "The elk." Instead, they told the full tale, how the hunters tracked the animal across frozen ground, how the village waited with hope and hunger, how the gods were invoked for strength, and how the feast brought every soul together beneath the same roof. In this way, memory was preserved, not in books or carvings, but in voices, softly spoken at the hearth, or carried with rhythm in the chants of rituals. The story of each hunt became a lesson, a teaching tool that bridged the past with the present. Legacies are not only written in words, but in the customs that endure, the reverence with which every bone was carved, every hide prepared, every drop of fat rendered into oil. These were acts of remembrance. They taught discipline, patience, and humility. To the Vikings, these customs were more than habit. They were living expressions of respect for the world around them, reminders that nothing should be taken for granted. Even today, traces of these values can be seen in northern traditions, where feasts, rituals, and community gatherings still echo that same sense of shared survival. The hunt also left its mark on Viking identity itself. To be a good hunter was not only to be strong and skilled, but to understand the balance of the natural world. A hunter who brought home food for many mouths became a figure of honor, someone remembered long after his lifetime. Songs and sagas celebrated not only warriors on battlefields, but hunters who faced the wilderness and returned victorious. Their courage, endurance, and wisdom were etched into the larger tapestry of Norse legend, blending survival with myth. And then there was the spiritual legacy. Each hunt carried with it whispers of gods and spirits. The people believed that Odin himself, god of wisdom and war, walked unseen in the forests, watching the hunters, testing their resolve. They believed that the great elk was not merely an animal, but a messenger, its life intertwined with theirs, its spirit journeying back to the divine realm when honored properly. The shamans, chants, the sacred fire, the offering of bones and scraps. These acts ensured that the hunt's meaning did not vanish with the passing of time. It became part of something eternal, part of the unseen fabric that held their world together. In the centuries that followed, even as Viking raiders sailed across seas and traders carried their goods to distant lands, the memory of such hunts remained a foundation of their culture. Their feasts abroad mirrored those at home. Their gatherings in foreign halls echoed the same stories told around their village fires. No matter how far they traveled, the values born of the hunt, the reverence for community, the gratitude for nature's gifts, the understanding of life's fragile balance, remained at the core of who they were. The legacy of the hunt extended, too, into their myths of creation and destiny. The great beasts of the forests and seas were not merely sustenance but symbols. To conquer them was to prove one's worth, to earn a place in the saga of the people. Legends told of hunters who pursued animals so mighty that they seemed to belong to another world. Some tales described them as guardians of hidden wisdom, their spirits transforming into guiding forces for the people. In these stories, the line between man, beast, and God blurred, forming a vision of life in which all were part of a grand cycle of transformation. As the Viking Age faded into history, many of their rituals disappeared, and yet the essence of their hunts still lingers. Archaeologists uncover antler combs, bone tools, carved amulets, all physical remnants of animals long gone. Each artifact is more than just a tool, it is a fragment of memory, a quiet reminder of the deep respect that guided Viking life. In museums and burial mounds, these objects continue to speak of nights filled with chanting, of fires that warmed entire villages, of the great hunts that fed whole communities. Even in modern times, the legacy of the Viking hunt resonates. We marvel at their courage, their resilience, their ability to thrive in a harsh and unforgiving land. We find in their practices a lesson still relevant today, that true strength lies not only in power but in responsibility, that to live is to give back, to honor what sustains us, and to remember that every gift of nature comes with its own sacred weight. The Vikings may be gone, but their legacy lives on, in stories, in songs, in the artifacts left behind, and in the very idea of balance between humankind and the natural world. Each hunt, though bound to its time, became part of something timeless. And so, as we reflect on how they fed whole villages with a single hunt, we also reflect on what it means to belong to a cycle greater than ourselves. The legacy of the hunt is not one of conquest, but of connection. It reminds us that survival is never only about what we take, but about how we honor, remember, and give in return. This was the Viking way. This was the story they left behind. The story of the Viking hunt is more than a tale of men, forests, and prey. It is a mirror, reflecting the values of an entire culture, a culture that saw survival not as an individual struggle, but as a collective journey. Every step, from the quiet preparation before dawn to the warmth of the feast that followed, was woven into a tapestry of meaning that outlived the hunters themselves. As we look back across the centuries, it is striking how carefully the Vikings balanced strength with reverence. They were fierce raiders, bold explorers, and skilled traders, yet in the forest, bow in hand, they were also students of nature. They knew that every successful hunt carried weight, the weight of responsibility, of gratitude, of sharing what was earned with those who waited in hunger. This sense of balance is part of why their legacy endures long after their longships vanished from the seas. The image of a single hunt feeding an entire village carries both drama and tenderness. It is a picture of desperate need transformed into communal abundance. We see in it the timeless rhythm of human life, scarcity and plenty, struggle and relief, fear and gratitude. For the Vikings, each hunt was a reminder of life's fragility. For us, centuries later, it is a lesson in humility and interdependence. In modern life, with food so easily available, it can be difficult to grasp the weight of such moments. But when we pause, we can still hear the echoes, the breath of hunters in the snow, the flicker of firelight in a crowded hall, the laughter of children tasting meat for the first time in weeks. These echoes remind us that our own lives too are part of a chain, one that stretches back through countless generations who survived by honoring what the earth provided. There is also a deeper, almost meditative rhythm in these stories. They invite us to slow down, to imagine not the rush of conquest, but the quiet patience of tracking an animal through frost-covered woods. They ask us to picture the stillness of waiting, the shared silence of hunters moving as one, the deep respect for life taken, and the gratitude that followed. These details soothe us into reflection, helping us understand that strength is never only about force, it is also about care, wisdom, and restraint. Perhaps this is why the story of the Viking hunt feels so timeless. It bridges the gap between survival and meaning, between the physical and the spiritual. It shows us that even in the harshest conditions, people found ways to transform necessity into ritual, hunger into gratitude, survival into legacy. Their hunts were not just moments of feeding the body, they were moments of feeding the spirit, binding individuals into community, and community into culture. As we end this journey, let us carry with us the essence of what the Vikings knew so well, that life is sustained not simply by what we take, but by how we honor it, how we share it, and how we remember it. The hunts are gone, the feasts are silent, but the lessons remain. In the quiet of your own life, may you hear their echo, an echo of resilience, reverence, and connection. And as sleep gently approaches, may their story remind you that, just like the Vikings, we are all part of a greater cycle, a cycle of giving and receiving, of honoring the past, and of living with gratitude in the present. The hunt is over, the fire fades, but the legacy remains. You have traveled with me through a long story, across forests, along icy rivers, into villages warmed by firelight. Together we followed the Vikings as they prepared for their great hunts, as they faced the silence of the woods, as they brought back enough food to sustain entire communities. You have walked with them, step by step, and now at the end of this journey, it is time to rest. Let the images drift gently in your mind, the snow falling softly on dark branches, the sound of hunters' boots pressing into frozen earth, the glow of torches lighting the way home. Picture the great hall filled with voices, laughter, and relief, and then imagine the silence that comes after, when the fires grow low and the village sleeps safe and warm, bellies full, hearts comforted. That same silence can now be yours. As you breathe slowly, imagine the rhythm of the hunt fading into the rhythm of your own breath. Inhale gently, as though drawing in the crisp northern air. Exhale as though releasing the weight of the day. Feel the body soften, the mind slow, and the heart grow calm. The Vikings knew the power of rest after struggle, and in this moment you too can surrender to that same timeless rhythm. The story you've heard is more than history, it is also a lullaby of endurance, gratitude, and peace. It shows us that strength is not only about action, but also about knowing when to be still. In the quiet after the hunt, the village found renewal, and here in the quiet after this story, you too may find your own renewal. Let yourself picture the village one last time. Outside, the northern wind moves across the fields, but inside, the walls of the hall hold warmth. Children sleep close to their parents, the elderly rest with peace, and the hunters themselves finally close their eyes. They trust the night to guard them, they trust tomorrow will come, and so can you. There is no need now for effort, no need for thought. The past is behind you, the story has been told, and all that remains is rest. With every breath your body grows heavier, like the deep stillness of a forest blanketed by snow. With every moment your mind drifts further into peace, like a ship carried gently across calm seas. Remember that you are safe here and now, just as the village was safe once the hunt was done. You too can release worry, hunger, or fear. You have what you need. You are surrounded by warmth, by the quiet of night, by the steady rhythm of your own breath. Allow yourself to let go. The Vikings trusted the cycle of life, the hunt, the feast, the rest, and the return of the sun, and you too can trust the cycle of your own body and mind. Night comes, rest follows, and in the morning light will return, bringing new strength and new life. But for now there is only this moment, a moment of stillness, a moment of surrender, a moment of deep healing rest. Close your eyes gently, like the closing of the hall's great doors after the feast. Feel the warmth within, the quiet around you, the softness of sleep drawing near. Let your breath carry you into dreams, calm and unhurried. The story is complete, the fire is low, the world is at rest, and so are you. Good night.